Tom Prohaska. I've been woodworking since I was about 15, but really using only the lathe for probably about 15 years. This is a pen turning class. There's many other things you can do with it: spindle turning, candlesticks, bowls, but this is only for pens. Sometimes it seems expensive, but you can make it cheaper or less expensive for yourself. If you want a pen out of a specific piece of Bacote wood for a pen, you can pay the $3.54 for a very specific blank. Or if someone requests lace wood from Australia, if you're just making one, it sort of makes sense to pay the less than $5 for just a single pen blank. But if you're making a bunch, you can just buy a piece of maple board that's already 3/4 inch thick. All your blanks are 3/4 inch thick. So all you do is put it in a table saw and rip down a board that you already have into 3/4 inch. Black walnut. A single blank of black walnut is probably going to be the same as all the others. $3.50, $4. You can get a piece of cut off black walnut. It doesn't matter that it's chewed up or chipped, because you're going to be turning all that away anyway. So getting a piece of black walnut, running it through the table saw and making a square. Now this entire square is about 4 pins worth. So at Woodcraft, that's $20. Or you can just buy the board for $20 and get about 40 blanks out of it. So most of the pen kits come in an entire kit, and the brass tubes inside are unfortunately different lengths. This particular kit is the Slimline kit from Penn State. Both pieces of brass are the exact same. They are nearly 2 inches long, almost to the thousandths of an inch. So you cut a piece of wood. It's best to go 2 1/8, 2 3/8, or 2 3/16 long, so you have just a little bit of overage. And what will happen is the brass tube will get glued in and recessed just slightly, and then we'll use a barrel trimmer that will cut the very end of that tube perfectly flat. And that is one key to getting a good pen assembly, is having the end perfectly 90 degrees to the brass tube. One thing to consider when you're cutting your blanks is to mark them so that when you reassemble them, the grain between the top half and the bottom half is continuous and matches. If you just started cutting a bunch of random pieces and throwing them in a pile, and then when it came time to turn, if you had a match set, when you go to assemble it, the grain pattern will follow. If you just have a big pile of cutoffs and you go and assemble it, you're going to have one piece that's slightly different color because it didn't come from the same tree, didn't come from the same board, continuous grain. So consider marking it. That's going to get turned away anyway, so it doesn't matter that it's a Sharpie or a paint or anything. Just a little bit extra to the overall finish of the pen. On a side note, the concept is the same for all of it, is putting a brass tube into a piece of wood or material of any kind, letting it dry, and then turning it. This is a toothpick holder you can put on a keychain. This is a letter opener, but still the same thing. A brass tube that gets glued into a material and turned around. A duck call, just a piece of wood with a hole in it, turned around. So same concept over and over. Brass tubes. This one, the tubes are 2 different sizes, 2 different lengths, and it'll make a fountain pen. So the things you have to be concerned with is which pen kit did you get and which drill bit is going to be used to drill out your hole. If you get a sample kit, I think they're called, you can get ones that have, this one is gunmetal. It might come with 5 different finishes: chrome, antique brass, one of each. And then this is a 7mm. It'll come with a 7mm drill bit, and then the 7mm bushings for turning. So that's one way to get started, is to get the kit and have multiple kits and everything that goes with it. You can use epoxy and glue up Corian. This is 2 layers of Corian countertop glued together, drilled, and then filled out. This takes, for me, about 5 times as long or more to turn it around, because it's very hard, but it makes a nice finish. For the acrylic blanks, you are best to use a specific drill bit for acrylic. It's got a much steeper point to it, and what that does is less likely to blow out the back end when it comes out the end. If you use a brad point on acrylic, it's just going to shatter.
I hope y'all's windows are up.
What?
I hope y'all's windows are up.
Yeah. All right. So, one thing I like to do is use Play-Doh. What Play-Doh does is, when you drill the hole, and I use epoxy almost 99% of the time, and you take the brass tube and you start pushing it in, it's very, very thin walled. The epoxy might be just a hair thicker, and what it does is start pooling inside. If you take Play-Doh, roll it out, make a plug. Some people use potatoes, but I find many neighbors have kids that are slightly grown, and they're more than willing to give this stuff to you so they don't have it in their household. So make a plug with the Play-Doh, and then when you push the brass tube in, all it does is all the excess gets pushed out, and it makes a plug. And then once it finally hardens, I have some dental pick tools that I can pull the plug out with. One of the preparations is to take some sandpaper, it doesn't matter, 120, 180, 220, and to scuff the brass, because when it comes from the factory, it was most likely extruded. The extrusion process to make a brass tube has a machine oil in it to lubricate it, so it can be pulled through the die and stretched, and that machine oil stays on it. And also the sandpaper will cause micro grooves in it, which gives it what's called a tooth for the glue to stick to, as opposed to a perfectly smooth piece of brass. Once I do that, I'll take a small rag with, I use denatured alcohol, just put very little on it, and you can wipe off the grease. 5-minute epoxy doesn't mean it cures in 5 minutes, it means it's only open working time 5 minutes. It still takes 24 hours for it to cure. So if you're in a real hurry, you can use CA or super glue. You'll want to use the thick because the wood has grain in it. It's not perfectly smooth, where CA likes two perfectly smooth surfaces to create that. So with the thicker CA glue, it'll fill all the gaps and it'll cure within 10-15 minutes to allow you to start turning faster if you're in that much of a hurry. So that is it about the kits. Short of, I save any of the plastic containers that my wife has for food that hadn't had food in it, that was just a case and the food was wrapped in something so it's not greasy or oily. I found a massive box of failed chopsticks at Mike's Merchandise. They are just the right size to fit in the hole for filling in the epoxy and wood. Since I only paid $3 for close to 1,000, I don't care about breaking them off and throwing that part away. It's an inexpensive way of stirring your glue and getting it on the wood. In a container like that allows you to put all the pieces in while it dries, and then even if it does stick to it, even if it tears it when you pull the blank out, it doesn't really matter because you're going to throw it away anyway. Alright, now the tools. This is the lathe, this is your head, this is the chuck. We're only using the chuck to hold this piece of blank because we're going to change it out for a pin mandrel for the actual turning. This is just for practice. We have a live center on the tailstock. It's turning with the wood. We have the banjo, the tool rest. We're going to adjust just a hair below the center line of the turning axis. A machinist method of squaring up is to look down at the bed, look across the far edge of the tool rest, and line it up with one of the edges of the bed. And that way when you go straight across, you know you're creating a parallel line instead of a taper. Once you get it all set up, you want to rotate it one full turn by hand to make sure nothing is sticking out and going to hit the tool rest. So the grain of the wood is going in line with the headstock and tailstock, so this is a spindle cutting versus a piece of wood that's turned 90 degrees and hooked to a faceplate, and you're turned like a bowl, and that way you're getting end grain and long grain, end grain and long grain, so you use different tools. So this is spindle turning. We have a roughing gouge, which is designed to knock off these large corners and get it round fairly quickly. You got a spindle gouge that has a shallower flute than a bowl gouge, and a taper cutting area. Only the very, very edge is the cutting edge. This is the bevel, and then some call that the root, or just the part of the tool that isn't going to cut. We have the other variation, which is a carbide insert. This comes from the metal lathe industry. Instead of having to sharpen tools, it was easier for them to just take off this. This has 4 cutting sides, so when one got dull, all they had to do was rotate it 90 and they were back to cutting. So with that, there are some companies that sell this as a complete tool. They make a square one, for one of them calls it roughing. They make round ones for detailing and shaping. It's all a matter of preference, but the regular high-speed tools require you to ABCD, anchor. It has to be on the tool rest. No matter how strong you think you are, if you try to hold it in the air and try to cut, you can't hold it. It's got to be anchored before it starts to cut. Second, the bevel. You want it to keep lowering the tool until it touches the bevel. The bevel isn't going to cut, so it's not going to catch. Once it touches that, you can pull it down just a little bit and raise the handle just a little bit, and then the cutting edge will engage and start putting wood off. Once you get that, D, direction. So if you want it to go that way, you're going to tilt the tool in the direction that you want it to cut, and then it'll continue in the direction. Same goes for any of the tools, is anchor it first, find the bevel, then raise the handle a little bit, get it to cut, and then go in the direction that you want it to cut. The difference is a carbide tool always needs to be flat. You have to consider the thickness of the tool, and you want it directly in center line with the drive and the point of the spear of the tailstock. And there's no getting around not being level. If you're too high and trying to go down, that's dangerous. If your tail or tool rest is too low and you try to go up in an up position to try to come center line, that's another dangerous position. But this is more of a tearing type cut because the back bevel is not supporting the wood fibers. With the bevel rubbing and cutting, as you think of wood as a bunch of straws, and as the cutting edge comes down and starts cutting, the bevel is supporting the wood underneath it, and a sharp tool is shearing the wood fibers off rather than just tearing them out. So we are going to use the roughing gouge to get this to become round. Still not there yet. Still got some flat spots. You saw how fast it went with the large roughing gouge. This is just a more detailed spindle gouge that for better detail, but it still does the same cutting action. Alright, now we're going to see what a carbide tool does. It cuts a little more aggressively. You can see the fiber tear outs. So you're going to have a lot more sanding to do with that type of tool. The skew is probably one of the best tools for leaving a finish, but it's also one of the hardest tools to learn. Now that finish there is almost, other than a couple tear outs, it's almost ready to be final sanded, or if you move the tool rest out of the way, you can take your sawdust and burnish it with a turning, but you always want to have the tool rest out of the way so your hand doesn't get caught. And that's almost ready for a finish. So there we turned around, and that's the basic concept of what you're going to do with the mandrel. Now for pin turning, there's two, what's called a mandrel, to choose from. One is the less expensive one, or the less expensive, yeah. This is a number 2 Morris taper, sometimes listed as MT number 2. Some guy named Morse figured out an exact taper angle in steel between the male and the female that with no oil or threads it'll grab. So that's how this particular system works. There are bushings that are the exact size needed for your pen kit. This is where getting a sample kit comes in handy to make sure that your spacers are the exact diameter needed for your pin kit. And it's good once you wear them out. I've marked them in red where I've cut too deep, sanded too much, and they're not the right size anymore, but they're good for spacers. So there's the fixed distance one, which if your kit only comes with one barrel, you have to end up putting a whole bunch of spacers in. But instead of putting spacers and using the nut, you can get, I think they call it a mandrel saver, that replaces the nut and goes into tailstock and then just keeps clamping down until it clamps your wood blank, and that way you don't have to have the nut on the end. We'll use that one. Pin kits come with an assortment of parts, and we'll go through that once we're finished. But for this particular pin kit, the key diameter is the nib. So we need to turn the wood down to the diameter of that. We can't put this on as we turn it. It just doesn't work. So we use these spacers that are the exact size. So if we turn the wood down to this, we know it's going to fit perfectly on that. Now the key is to find 3 that are all the same size. So with me marking these, it doesn't matter whether I do it this way or this way, just as long as I match my line and the grain will follow. So we put on one end, the middle, the other end, this, and this particular one isn't going to fit, so we need the nut. Now, as I tightened it down, this turned, and you might be concerned that this isn't aligned with that, but it doesn't matter because it's round, and when you assemble it, it can go back together in any direction. Bring the tailstock up. You tighten it down just some, because the mandrel is just a small piece of metal, and mechanical action that you can create with the tailstock, you can push so hard on it that this bar will actually bow. So instead of turning perfectly centered, it'll whip, and you no longer have a round pin blank. So we've put the number 2 Morse taper mandrel into the headstock. We have the tail end supported. We have the 3 spacers in there. We'll move the tool rest up close. We eye the tool rest with the far edge of the tool bed to get it parallel. And with everything else, turn it by hand, 1 full revolution to make sure everything is going to clear. The difference between the roughing gouge and the spindle gouge is the roughing gouge is more coarse, more aggressive. Spindle gouge is finer detail, and the camera might be able to show that where the spindle gouge was, rubbing the bevel right behind the cut, you can see that the wood is shinier than where the spindle gouge was, the roughing gouge. So with the sharper the tool and the larger the surface area of the bevel, the less sanding you have to get done. But also it's a little bit slower, and it's a little bit harder to keep a extremely smooth surface. So I'm going to go back to cutting. get very close, you want to see how close to the bushing you are. You can use your fingernail to feel the edge. This is very, very close. I've got a couple ridges there, so I'm going to choose to sand out the ridges instead of using the tool to remove it. Just showing you a different technique. Make sure the tool rest is completely out of the way. You can even remove the tool rest. Now with the skew, I was able to get fairly good smooth surface already. So I'm going to start with around a 180 grit piece of sandpaper. I like to have I call it a functional pen. I like a pen that fits in my hand and I like to use it. You can create a very ornate pen that has a lot of shape to it, but I have never been able to actually use a pen like that. I like my pens to be used and not just put on display, so there's a trade-off. If you're using a extremely exotic piece of wood and trying to create a piece of art, you might add more embellishments to it. Or if you're just going to put it in your pocket and carry it around and use it that way, then I prefer a simpler shape. You can use a tip of the skew and cut a couple recesses in it and a piece of wire to burnish a couple black lines in it to spice it up a little bit, but I prefer the simpler outlines. So I'm going to start with a 180. Now, the rotation of the wood is rotating this way, but the grain is going this way. So after each sanding, you'll want to stop it and take whatever sandpaper you're using and go in the direction of the grain, just like you would for any other piece of furniture or any other wood project that you're working on. Just one rotation is more than enough. Then use a rag to give it one wipe, because sandpaper is a paper with an adhesive with grit, and this grit is of a particular size and it doesn't 100% stay on this. That's why it wears out. So this 180 grit is going to be resting in the sawdust, and once you go to the next level, this one is 220. If I didn't clean that off, now I'd have 180 particles stuck in the dust, and then when I use my 220, it's not going to refine the finish. It's just going to cut more of the 180. 320. There are multiple finishes you can do for pins. One that creates an extremely shiny, durable finish is CA glue, but it takes a very specific one. But it does make a very durable, long-lasting finish. The others I will show you here in a second. This is looking really good. So we have it finished. We're going to inspect it one last time. Looks good. There's no cut marks on it. No gouges. The ends are flush with the other parts. I like this Hut Perfect Pen Polish. It's basically a hard plastic that works only on pens. If you try to do it on a bowl, it won't work, I know. So we're going to turn the speed up, and what that does is create a friction that actually melts the plastic onto it, and then we'll use a rag to polish it out, and then we'll use the second part of this system to put the final coat on. Long-lasting polish. Not seeing any score marks. Looks complete all the way across. So we're done with that. And then the next step is to go to assembly. I've found out of the thousands that I've made, at least 2 of the mechanisms not having the threads inside. You can disassemble them if something goes wrong, but it takes hardly any time at all to take the ink portion, thread it in, and make sure it threads in. It does. So we're going to take the blank and set it down, and we're going to put a nib in, and we're going to put the mechanical portion in, and then the pocket clip, and then assemble it. Press it down until it mates. It doesn't need to go any further. This here is the next step. This is a trial and error, which I call. We need to make sure it goes in a completely straight line. If it starts going in at a slight angle, it can crack the wood. Normally it's somewhere between the brass and the ring. It all varies with how much of the wood when you did the barrel trimmer. So with the way it is right now, the insert all the way in and the mechanism all the way screwed, it's just barely sticking out. You do not want to try to push it further with the insert in because it's plastic and it'll break. So you gotta take the insert out. Put a hand on it, feel it move. Try it again. Retract it, see how far it goes down. It goes down a whole lot, doesn't stick out that far. A little bit more. And if you can't tell it moving, if you put your finger on the wood and the mechanism, as you apply pressure, all of a sudden you'll feel it move. Okay. I prefer about that much sticking out. We'll put the center piece on. Just slips on and it stays loose. Now we got to do the opposite end, which is the pocket and they call it the cap. This is where I like to look at the wood and find the least interesting part, and that's where I want the clip to go so it doesn't detract from any nice piece of wood. And that's good and tight. Now with it closed, this is where the grain alignment comes in. It's kind of hard to see with the black walnut, but there is a cathedral piece, and that matches that piece. So when it goes together, the grains match. And then when the pen gets worn out, you just pull it apart. You unthread this. You can find this at Staples. You can go online and find them in different colors, but I believe Staples only carries the black. So if you're interested in other colors, you have to go and get online something other than what Staples has. And there's the pen.